Hi everyone. In this video we're going to be taking a look. We're continuing on with this massive section that we are looking at, which is section 3. And this is looking specifically at erythrocytes. So we're going to just be taking a look at characteristics of erythrocytes, kind of the birth and the death of erythrocytes as well. It's a bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? So here's our red blood cell. Red blood cells, as you probably are aware of their shape, they are going to be one of those really interesting kind of biconcave shape where it's going to be thicker on the outside and thinner on the inside, kind of like a donut. Maybe they didn't do the donut quite right. They didn't get the hole punched out all the way and just left a thin thing of dough right in the middle. That's kind of like what your erythrocytes are like right there. We're going to talk about how important it is that it has that structure, because one of the main things that this whole biconcave shape gives is surface area. It is going to increase the surface area of this red blood cell. So more surface area means that we can pack more hemoglobin into this thing, and that means that we can carry around so much more oxygen because of the surface area of this. Look at that, 280 million hemoglobins in one single red blood cell. That's crazy, isn't it? Let's take a look at some other things, why it's good to have this biconcave shape. Another thing is its ability to kind of flex and bend when it needs to. So even though 97% of a red blood cell is hemoglobin, you do have some of the spectrin protein, and this is going to kind of help with its flexibility. It's also important for support because we're going to talk about in a minute how it loses all of its organelles, but it still has a little bit of the support from the protein to kind of keep its structure going. Another thing about the shape is they're kind of shaped a little bit like a poker chip, where you kind of have the edges a little bit higher than the middle. So because of that, they can kind of stack up on top of one another and line up in a single file. And this is called rouleau. I've seen it with an X before. Rouleau means roll in French, but that's going to be really important so it can go through and kind of turn corners when it needs to, going through the capillaries. All right, let's move up and talk about this right here. Remember, we went through erythropoiesis. We went through how in the red bone marrow it has a nucleus, but it spits it out and it gets rid of pretty much all of these cellular organelles. There's a few reasons why it does this. Number one, it wants to get rid of everything inside so it can just have room for its main function, which is to transport oxygen. So less organelles, less nucleus taking up space, more hemoglobin, more oxygen. So that's one of the good things about having no cellular organelles or no nuclei. Now the problem with not having a nucleus is the fact that no mitosis, so no repair mechanism or no way to kind of replace yourself whenever you are old and dying. But we have the bone marrow constantly making red blood cells. As long as there is that, we'll talk about later on about erythropoietin and its importance in helping regulate that whole process. Let's see, other things about the lack of cellular organelles is it's able to kind of flow through the bloodstream a little bit because it's a little bit lighter. No mitochondria, that's a good thing. If you think about what mitochondria does, mitochondria is involved in aerobic respiration, right? So anytime there's oxygen around, mitochondria is going to eat it up and use it up. So think about it. The main function of erythrocytes is for transport of oxygen. If you had a mitochondria inside of your erythrocyte, then as soon as that oxygen came into the red blood cell, the mitochondria would eat it up. So then the red blood cell will get to a tissue and then it'll say, hey, I'm sorry, I don't have any oxygen for you, my mitochondria ate it up. So that would not be a good thing. So that's the benefit of not having some of these organelles. So even though it lacks some organelles, there's a reason for it, or it has another kind of mechanism to make sure that it's okay without it. So that's basic characteristics of the erythrocyte right there. So let's take a look at a little bit more about this coloration, because remember it talked about how red blood cells really are going to be the reason why our blood is going to be that red coloration. And we're also going to talk about where the oxygen comes from as well. So the hemoglobin is a red pigmented protein. That is going to be specifically where we get the color. So let's take a look at the whole process, or not process, but the structure of hemoglobin. We're going to talk about three main parts of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is basically going to be here's one thing, globins. These are the globins, these kind of twisted proteins. They are just giant proteins that are shaped a very certain way. And if they're not shaped this way, then of course they lose their function. So those are the globins that are in there. You have alpha and you have beta globins. Now let's take a look at what's attached to the middle of each of these globins. Do you see that kind of bluish disc with a red dot? The bluish disc is going to be a heme group. So all these little molecules with the CH2s and all of that hanging off, I guess I should say just carbons and hydrogens hanging off, because they're in different forms each time, or a different amount each place that you look. Those are going to be heme groups. I did not do good at circling that one. And then right smack dab in the center of it is going to be an ion, right in the middle. This is where oxygen actually binds, is right there. It's a very unstable binding, and it needs to be, because we need to be able to unattach oxygen easily whenever it gets to the tissues. So that's what, I guess I shouldn't say unstable, more like a weak binding. So if we take a look at the hemoglobin, let's go back and take a look at how many oxygens one hemoglobin can attach. 1, 2, 3, 4. So one single hemoglobin can bind 4 oxygen molecules. All right, let's think back to how many hemoglobin molecules are in one single red blood cell. About 280 million hemoglobins. So you take 280 million and you multiply by 4, you get over 1 billion. So that's over 1 billion oxygen molecules in one erythrocyte. And then if you think about how many erythrocytes are just in like a microliter of blood, it's about 5.2 million. Let's just say that is a lot of oxygen that's moving around inside of our bloodstream there. So we already talked about oxygen binding. Where does oxygen where do we get oxygen? So lungs, right? It's going to the blood, the red blood cells are going to move through the blood vessels and go to our lungs. That's where it picks up the oxygen. And then it's going to deliver it to all the different body tissues. So it needs to be able to rapidly detach. Now, carbon dioxide can bind to another part of the globin protein, or the hemoglobin, specifically on part of the globin protein. But carbon dioxide typically won't always bind to hemoglobin. We'll talk about that later on when we talk about in the respiratory system. Only about 20% of carbon dioxide is found on hemoglobin. And I mean, you don't want it to bind to the iron, because if it bound to iron, it's taking up oxygen. So that's definitely why you don't want it to be there. And once it gets to the lungs, carbon dioxide will detach after that. So let's take a look and see how this whole process, how oxygen kind of feeds into this whole red blood cell process. So because of the fact that red blood cells transport oxygen, that's really the stimulus of erythropoietin. So erythropoietin, remember, controls the whole erythropoiesis in the red blood cells, red bone marrow. The thing that stimulates it is oxygen levels. So you have these chemoreceptors. So blood is going to go into the kidneys. I mean, yeah, all blood is going to go into the kidneys because that's where blood is filtered. So it has these special chemoreceptors that are constantly monitoring oxygen levels. And so once it gets here, if it sees that our body's low on oxygen, well, its kidneys are going to detect that. Erythropoietin is going to be secreted, and then that goes to the bone marrow, and that's going to tell the bone marrow, hey, we need more red blood cells, right? Because more red blood cells means more oxygen. So it does it that way. Let's think about when our body has decreased levels of blood oxygen. Exercise, right? I mean, our body is using so much oxygen, then it's going to decrease then. Also, in a minute, we're going to talk about high altitude, blood loss, and things like that. So those are going to be different things that might decrease our blood oxygen levels and cause erythropoietin to be actually produced. I mean, it's a smart kind of mechanism to go in and see how many red blood cells we have in the body, but if you have a lung disorder, that can be a big problem, because if you have a lung disorder, most of the time your red blood cells, you have enough, you just have issues with the amount of oxygen that's on your red blood cells. So sometimes it can give the wrong impression to the body saying, hey, we need more red blood cells. But I mean, it's just your body's way of trying to make sure that it has plenty of oxygen, right? So we talked about testosterone and, of course, how it is going to produce, it's going to stimulate EPO production. So there's that one. Other things, this should be another major one. So don't think that the environmental factors have to do with testosterone. But environmental factors are another thing that's going to help, that are going to go in and stimulate EPO, like high altitude. If you go to high altitude, there's going to be less available oxygen. So it's your body's way of saying, not enough oxygen, we need to produce more red blood cells. So lower atmospheric pressure kind of goes along with that. That's why some athletes will train at high altitude, is because it actually causes more red blood cells to be made. More red blood cells means more oxygen. More oxygen means longer endurance. So, so some will actually train in high altitude. This can be an issue, though, because if you have more red blood cells in the bloodstream, you have more things floating around in the bloodstream, and that is going to go in and thicken the blood, so that increases the viscosity, and that can cause a lot of problems with the cardiovascular system, and we'll take a look at that once we get into the future chapters, the next couple of chapters. So kind of on the same lines as this whole increased erythrocytes, let's take a look at another thing that some athletes might do to enhance their performance, but this is actually illegal, so it's banned from athletic competition. One method of blood doping is self-donation of erythrocytes. So prior to the competition, they'll have blood removed, and then that actually stimulates EPO production. But then right before the competition, they'll put those erythrocytes right back in. So they are going to have a lot more erythrocytes than they used to. And again, more erythrocytes means more oxygen, which means more endurance, because their body's able to keep on with the aerobic respiration and not have to, go to anaerobic respiration. A second method of blood doping is just injecting pharmaceutical EPO. So again, this is really dangerous because of blood viscosity, makes the heart work harder. It can cause issues with blood pressure and things like that. And I mean, it gives an unfair advantage to that individual, right? So we went over the birth of a red blood cell. We went through characteristics. The life of a red blood cell, its main thing is to just deliver oxygen around to all the different tissues. It goes to the lungs, it picks up oxygen, it moves to the tissues, it goes back, it does that over and over and over again. So yeah, they don't live very long, maybe about 128 days. So remember, they don't have a nucleus, so they can't really build any kind of repair proteins or anything like that. So what happens is they're just destroyed. But the good thing about that is we can recycle, or our body can go in and recycle a lot of these components of a red blood cell, specifically a lot of the components of the hemoglobin. So let's say that you have an old red blood cell. It's on its last leg. It's going to go to the spleen. It goes through the spleen a lot, but eventually when it hits the spleen, the macrophages are going to detect that it's an old red blood cell and it needs to be, of course, broken down. It needs to be eaten and it needs to be broken down. So the macrophages in the bloodstream, and the spleen is also known as like the erythrocyte graveyard because that's where old red blood cells go to die. They can go to the liver as well, but a lot of it happens in the spleen. So the macrophage is going to, here it is, it's taking it up, that poor old red blood cell, and what it's going to do is it's going to break it down and it is going to release a lot of the components, the 3 major components I talked about earlier in hemoglobin. So we're going to take a look and see what happens to globin. We're going to take a look and see what happens to iron, and then the heme. The iron is stripped from the heme right there. Why don't we start with globin? Globin is probably the easiest one to start with. So remember, globin, this is just a protein. Proteins are made of amino acids. So we can go in and break down this protein into an amino acid. It goes into the bloodstream, and then it can go back to the red bone marrow, and we can make more globins, or it can be used to make other proteins in the body. It's really just what kind of need there is for the different amino acids. So that's one thing, or that's one of the components. Let's take a look at iron. A little bit of iron is going to be lost, like in your feces, in your sweat, and your urine. You get a little bit more lost with menstruation or injury. So you do need to replace iron with dietary iron. You can just take in fortified cereals, grain, anything that's going to have these kind of fortified grains like bread, dark leafy green vegetables like spinach, those kind of things. But what's going to happen, so that's showing the loss that's going to happen there. But usually it's going to be transported around onto transferrin. It kind of tells you what it's doing, right? Transferrin, Fe is going to be iron. And then it's going to go a couple of places. Once it's attached to transferrin and it moves around in the bloodstream, and it's actually, if it's not hooked onto transferrin, iron is toxic to the body, so that's why it needs to be hooked on. Anyway, so once it's hooked onto transferrin, it can go over to the liver and it can be stored there as ferritin. And it can also be transferred or transported to the red bone marrow so it can be reused again. So that's another great thing, is it can be reused again there. Now let's take a look at heme, because heme is going to be where it gets a little bit more complicated. So heme is going to go through these kind of color changes here because it's going through these kind of chemical changes that's going to happen. So heme, again, we already got rid of the iron, and then it's going to be converted to something called biliverdin. If you use your Spanish words, you will know what color this is, biliverdin. This is going to be a green pigmented color. And then after that, it's going to be broken down into bilirubin. Bilirubin is going to be that pigment that's more of the kind of orangish, yellowish coloration. So there's a few things that can happen with bilirubin. Is it will go to the liver, it can be transported to the liver, and we can use it to make bile, which is great. Or it can be sent to the digestive tract. So, or actually, once it's in bile, it will eventually go into our digestive tract because that's where bile eventually goes, and we can recycle it. Or ones that aren't recycled, then they are sometimes absorbed back into the blood and it's converted to urobilin, and then that's excreted in the urine, which makes sense, right? Because if you think about the color of your urine, it's about the color of the urobili. So, or sorry, the bilirubin. Some of it's going to be lost or stay inside of the small intestine, and then it's broken down even further into stercobilin, and that goes even further into color changes. So that's going to be more of a brown coloration, if you can, of course, if you think about it that way. So that's going to be the interesting kind of things that happen to the different components of the red blood cell. And if you think about these colorations, I always find it really interesting looking at the colorations that happen. If you get a bruise, then you notice at the very beginning with that bruise, it's kind of a red, purple, blue color. Well, what's happening is you just injured your capillary, so there's like this big kind of gaping hole in your capillary, and the red blood cells and other things are going to escape. They're going to be so excited because red blood cells, they never leave the bloodstream. So they're going to kind of collect in your tissues wherever you hit yourself. But macrophages are there. Macrophages are going to be saying, no, red blood cells, you don't belong here. I'm going to have to break you down. So it will go through the whole process. The macrophages will go through that process right there in the tissues of being broken down. So if you think about after the kind of the red, purple, blue coloration of your bruise, it turns in kind of greenish. It's going through this whole process. There's green. Do they want me to do that? And then it will kind of turn into a yellow color at the very end. So that's the interesting thing that's happening there with some colorations of bruising. So let's take a look at just a couple of erythrocyte disorders here before we get into blood type. One of the most common erythrocyte volume disorders, or just erythrocyte disorders in general, is anemia, where the percentage of functioning erythrocytes are going to be lower than normal. And of course, if you have less red blood cells, that means you don't have as many oxygen molecules as well. So the oxygen carrying capacity is reduced. And so you're going to get things like lethargy because your cells are not going to have the oxygen that they need to perform cell respiration, shortness of breath. The body's trying to go in and get more oxygen. It's sensing that there's not enough oxygen, so it's going in and getting a little bit more oxygen. Pallor, palpitation, so that's going to be that kind of ashen color palpitations. This is, of course, because you don't have as many red blood cells. Look at all of these different types of anemia. You have aplastic anemia, you have congenital hemolytic anemia, erythroblastic anemia, hemorrhagic anemia, pernicious anemia, sickle cell anemia. So they can be either from blood loss, hemorrhagic anemia, hemorrhagic anemia. Took me a little bit to say that one, didn't it? Or it can be because you don't have the proper tools to build a red blood cell, like your pernicious anemia. If you don't have enough B12, or your B12 is not being produced, then that is going to lead to pernicious anemia. Or it can be genetic because your body's not going in and making the proper hemoglobin shape. So that's going to be where sickle cell comes in. So this is what it looks like, a normal red blood cell. This is what happens when your blood cell is going to sickle because of sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease. And one of the globin molecules are not being produced, so because you're missing part of these the hemoglobin, or the globins, then of course they're going to form this kind of sickled shape like that. And if you just can imagine how all of the things that are going to be an issue with this, it's not going to be able to carry as much oxygen. It's going to get stuck in different blood vessels and things like that. So lots of different issues that come about with sickle cell anemia. Some of these can be treated with EPO to kind of kick in the red blood cell production. And then some can actually signal an underlying problem, like some kind of you're bleeding because of a stomach ulcer. So that can be one as well. So you might, or hemorrhoids can also cause a type of anemia. So that's why sometimes you have to go and fix the underlying problem first. So let's go ahead and take a look at the opposite of anemia and take a look at polycythemia. So poly is, of course, going to be many. And then this is going to be where you have a higher percentage of erythrocytes in your blood than normal. And again, this is going to be, we talked about this like with blood doping. You have very viscous blood. It puts a strain on the heart because it increases viscosity. So it can be caused by, there it is, increased EPO. Maybe you're doing it to yourself on purpose. Or dehydration can cause polycythemia. So if you think about what dehydration is you have less water in the bloodstream, so you have a higher percentage of erythrocytes in the blood because of it. Look, chronic hypoxia, even lung disorders like COPD, because of the fact that there's issues with the gases, the body's thinking, oh, not enough oxygen, so it'll go through and just pump out these massive amounts of red blood cells because it's thinking that there's not enough oxygen. And then also caused by unregulated erythrocyte growth as well. So the next video we're going to look at, or what we're going to talk about in the next video, is going to be the different blood types and different transfusions. So until next time.